我们就15分钟，所以我是陆克文，你好，再见。Thank you. 我离开了政界之后呢，我的效率越来越高。I will just let me say one or two things in Chinese to our friends here, and then I'll speak in English. 尊敬的王济思院长，尊敬的各位贵宾，女士们、先生们，下午好。首先感谢北京论坛邀请我参加这个2013年的会议。我今天选择的题目是新型大国关系的心理及剖析。别担心，我会用英文来讲。但是在我开始今天的演讲之前，我想首先用个人的话，对发生在天安门附近的恐怖袭击事件表示强烈的谴责。任何形式的恐怖主义，无论其政治动机是什么呢，都是一种屠杀，是对我们共同文明的威胁，应该受到全世界人民的谴责。同时，对那些在这次袭击中失去生命和受伤的无辜受害者们，我对他们的遭遇深表遗憾。这一起恐怖事件也提醒了我们，世界范围内文明国家面临的共同的问题。谢谢大家。My topic today is the psychology and the anatomy of a new form of great power relations. Sometimes people simply emphasize the differences between us, between East and West, between developed and developing countries, between China and the United States. I believe the things we have in common are in fact far greater than the things that separate us. And the purpose of this Beijing Forum, both at a level of scholarship and of policy debate, is to advance the common project we share, namely the harmony of civilizations. The truth is, how we think about each other matters. Both in domestic politics and in international relations, mindsets, 思维, matters. How I perceive the language, the behavior and the motivations of other individuals, of other cultures and of other states affects my language and behavior towards them. Therefore, clearly analysing our respective mindsets is not just a useful scholarly task for the academy. It is also an active concern of modern international politics. As a former Prime Minister, Foreign Minister and professional diplomat of Australia, I've long believed that ideas matter in how we choose to shape our common future. We do not live in a predetermined or determinist world. We do not live in a world destined for competition, conflict or war. The truth is we choose our futures. And the choices we make about our futures are shaped by a range of interrelated factors. One, the values we have, whether they are values specific to our individual cultures or whether they are universal. Two, the ideational framework we have for understanding the world. Three, the political mindset which derives from this framework. Four, the subjective perceptions we have of each other. And five, the objective interests we have for ourselves, which may conflict with those of others. The beginning of wisdom in international relations is to understand how our choices are made and how other people think and analyse, and how the choices, therefore, of others are made as well. Statesmanship lies in finding the common ground between these understandings. Because if common ground exists, it becomes a beachhead for managing areas of difference in a cooperative manner, rather than one which privately assumes that competition and conflict are inevitable. This means that both our scholarship and our diplomacy must be active and acute. The alternative is simply to allow what I have often called strategic drift to occur. Strategic drift is usually the product of passive and inert diplomacy. Strategic drift is where both individuals and states wait to see how events unfold before then reacting to those events. I believe the responsibility of diplomats and statesmen is to understand the forces that are in fact shaping events, but in addition, through constructive diplomacy, to then shape those events further for the common good. This is where both analysis and policy, or both scholarship and politics, must come together. Scholars and politicians should not see themselves as occupying different universes. Given the complexity of the current global order and the vast array of challenges facing it, these two traditions, that is, scholarship and politics, analysis and policy, must be brought together more closely than ever before. For far too long, international relations scholars have often tended to construct a binary, ideational world between so-called classical realists on the one hand and liberal internationalists on the other. Classical realists often attack liberal internationalists as being too detached from basic power politics and too preoccupied with creating an idealist international order. By contrast, liberal internationalists often dismiss classical realists as perpetuating the status quo and undermining the potential effectiveness of international institutions to effectively solve problems in the real world. International relations scholars are fully aware of the fact that many attempts in recent decades have been made to form an ideational consensus between neo-realists and neoliberals. But the truth is actually more simple than that. We all have some idea of what the world is really like. At the same time, we all have some idea of what we would like the world to become by building a better international order. For these reasons, I have long argued that both these academic traditions have much to contribute to the current and difficult task of diplomats, political leaders and statesmen around the world. Once again, this is where the Beijing Forum has a potentially useful role to play, not in going through the motions of being nice to each other, but in crafting both an ideational and political way forward for the nations of the world, where we are all faced with the tensions arising from the pull of national politics on the one hand and the new global politics we confront every day as we wrestle with the new challenges to security, the global economy, and not least to the global environment. We therefore find ourselves at a point where the classical nation-state wants to retain its sovereignty on everything, while in its more honest moments, reflecting that every time we must enter into a new international agreement, because the problems we face are both national and global, we are also sharing our sovereignty with others. Let me turn my remarks now to China-US relations in particular, where this truly becomes a sharp-edged dilemma is, of course, in crafting both the ideational foundation as well as the practical diplomatic road ahead for the future of China-US relations. And furthermore, we should ask ourselves whether President Xi Jinping's concept of a new form of great power relations provides an effective framework for achieving this objective for the future. That is why I strongly recommended to the conference organisers for this year's Beijing Forum that we should focus on this core theme for the 10th Forum. Professor Wang Jise has already provided an eloquent introduction to the subject. Wang Yuanzhang, 感谢你. And this is in the papers that have been circulated before the conference. He has provided, as usual, a first-class scholarly contribution. By contrast, my contribution will be crude and political. My own exposition of a new model of great power relations is outlined in the article I wrote in the US publication Foreign Affairs in their April edition this year. And in the spirit of contemporary Chinese politics, I'm happy to offer my contribution to both criticism and self-criticism consistent with the current spirit of Chinese politics. 我可以进行一些自我批评，你可以给我一些批评，好不好？ I've entitled this short paper today, The Psychology and Anatomy of a New Model of Great Power Relations. I have deliberately done so because I believe in this most critical relationship. What we think about each other and what we then choose to do together are of equal importance. Let me make 5 core points. First, We have already made some progress, to the extent that both President Xi Jinping and President Obama and their most senior officials have both, by and large, embraced the language of the need to build a new model of great power relations. This is no small thing. For some time, US-China relations has lacked any central organising concept. Strategic engagement, strategic competition, China a responsible global stakeholder, all these concepts have been circulating in the last 2 decades, but none of them have been fully embraced by both sides. This has been a real problem and I believe has contributed to strategic drift between Washington and Beijing in recent times. Prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, the central organising principle of China-US relations was China-US cooperation being anti-Soviet, and had been that way for the previous 20 years. Therefore, agreeing on a new conceptual framework, however broad, is a welcome development in itself. The fact that we are now here in Beijing today talking about this is better than the alternative. This is progress, however small. Second, I now believe there is sufficient political will in both capitals to make this work. I base that on my conversations both with President Obama and President Xi Jinping. I would not have said that with any confidence 12 months ago. Therefore, the presence of this political will should provide sufficient support and encouragement to both scholars and policy analysts to work now on the conceptual framework for this new brand of great power relations and what its policy content might be. Of course, it is very easy to come up with a new form of language or a new expression. It is much harder to populate the concept with real content. We are all familiar with the conceptual origins of 新型大国关系. We are all familiar with the historical examples of existing great powers and emerging great powers and the so-called Thucydides trap. However, while we understand what we are trying to avoid, we do not yet know what the alternative positive construct is for the US-China relationship for the future. Both the American and Chinese sides will inevitably have different approaches to this. For example, the Americans will want China to fully enter the existing rules-based order as a great power, accept that these rules benefit China, and therefore expect that China will never seek to change these rules for the future. Our friends in Beijing may have a different view on this. Our friends in Beijing may also want to ensure that the content of a new model of great power relations incorporates American acceptance of what China believes to be its core interests, its 核心利益, including China's position on contentious territorial issues on its maritime boundary. We know, therefore, what both sides want to avoid, and that is conflict. But we're not quite sure yet what both sides want to build, and there is the problem. Knowing what we are against is one thing, knowing what we are for is something else. That is why this conference is potentially so important. Third, in order to overcome the strategic trust deficit which exists between China and the US, there are 2 possible approaches. One best can be described as top-down. In other words, to reach a general statement of common strategic purpose between China and America, which then drives every other element of the relationship in a particular direction. Historically, the example lies in the Shanghai Communiques of 1972 and 1978. These documents were important in shaping the future. In the future, there may also be need for a new Shanghai Communique to formally define the future post-Cold War framework of the US-China relationship. But the time for that has not yet come because the conceptual agreement necessary for such a communique has not been reached. The other strategic approach to dealing with the trust deficit is bottom-up. In other words, to identify areas of common practical cooperation which step by step trust builds. My argument is that both China and America need to be working on both these approaches at once, top-down and bottom-up. The relationship needs a new conceptual framework, but agreeing on the detail of one is impossible unless strategic trust is also built in practical ways. Furthermore, practical cooperation projects can only go so far in building strategic trust before they run into fundamental ideational or ideological obstacles. Therefore, we must work from both directions at once, top-down and bottom-up. Fourth, the scope of practical cooperation should cover strategic, economic and environmental cooperation. At the strategic level, China and the US could consider negotiations between themselves on the final ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Simultaneously, they could begin work together on global nuclear non-proliferation questions, including North Korea, Iran and other states. China and the US could also further enhance their cooperation on global counterterrorism. Within the Asia-Pacific region, they should use the East Asia Summit to develop a new set of confidence and security-building measures in Asia to reduce the possibility of conflict by miscalculation. And at a very practical level, China, the US and the other EAS states should take further their cooperation on counter-natural disaster response mechanisms. On economic cooperation at the level of the G20, which we in Australia host next year, China and the US should work concretely on the new drivers of new global economic growth. This work is now urgent for the global economy. This should include how to combine private investment capital with sovereign wealth funds, together with global public institutions like the IMF, the World Bank and regional development banks, to finance infrastructure needs across the world with a sustainable rate of return. Other drives of economic growth should include similar funding investments for the global clean energy revolution. Also measures to radically increase global female participation in the workforce. China and the US should also cooperate on bringing the current WTO round to a conclusion. A Beijing-Washington consensus on a comprehensive Doha text would virtually guarantee the conclusion of the round, which would provide new momentum to global economic growth. Regionally, the US should ensure that China can become a full participant in the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership. The TPP should not become an anti-Chinese economic bloc. Bilaterally, Chinese and American investment flows should be liberalised more within both countries so that economic interdependencies grow and grow. And as for environmental cooperation, China's policy on global cooperation on climate change has changed rapidly since the Copenhagen conference, which I attended in 2009. China's domestic policy settings have changed significantly with a price on carbon being established. China and America should now discuss how they best provide the common political momentum to drive stalled climate change negotiations towards a successful global conclusion. Also, as the world's two largest carbon-emitting countries, they now have a responsibility to do so. Finally, China and the US need an institutional mechanism both to drive and review progress on the work program that I have just outlined above. This is why the early convening of a working-level summit between President Obama and President Xi Jinping held in California in June was so important. It must become the first in a series of working-level summits. It is only with the direct personal political engagement of the two presidents that this work program can have any prospect of success. It also means that both the Americans and the Chinese need a single point person in both capitals to drive this long-term agenda of strategic cooperation forward, as well as manage day-to-day political foreign policy problems between China and the US when they inevitably arise. If a mechanism such as this is successfully developed over time, it also has the great advantage of encouraging the development of a culture of strategic cooperation in partnership between the two sides. To conclude, I'm optimistic about the possibility of success in developing both a new concept and a new reality of what President Xi Jinping has called a new form of great power relations. This is no easy task, given the enormous difficulties between China and the US and differences as civilizations, cultures and as political systems. This will be very difficult work indeed. 非常困难. But with political will on both sides, it can be done, which means that there will be some compromises necessary on all sides. As I said in the beginning of my remarks today, ideas matter. Ideas combined with political will can be very powerful and will shape the choices we make for the future. Choices which either result in conflict or choices which preserve the peace in what I've called before a new Pax Pacifica. Not a Pax Americana, not an American peace, not a Pax Sinica, not a Chinese peace, but truly a Pax Pacifica. I thank you for your attention.